Don't look now. AI is lying to you. Let's talk about why and what you can do about it. Welcome to Dave Lenthicum is Not AI. I'm Dave, an AI SME and an AI skeptic, looking at AI with a balanced perspective. Let's get started. So you may remember from the news from the past couple of years. First would be a story about Air Canada. A tribunal in British Columbia held Air Canada was responsible for its website chatbot giving an incorrect bereavement fare fund guidance and ordered the airline to pay the customer. It looks like $812 in damages and fees. Not a big deal, but it did make the press. Also a story around Google's Bard. Google's Bard made an incorrect James Webb Space Telescope claim in promotional materials, after which Alphabet shares fell 3 to 8% in a day. It was widely reported as roughly, U.S. In terms of dollars, $100 billion in market value was erased. Whoopsie. And then finally, a story from CNET. CNET faced significant backlash after reviews found many errors in its AI-assisted personal finance articles, leading to dozens of corrections and changes to its AI publishing approach. And that was from a few years ago as well. These are all instances where AI got things wrong. And so when the generative AI stuff took off in 2022, many organizations kind of rushed to use the chatbot features and things like that for customer service, for writing articles, because they considered it, a path to efficiency. In other words, we didn't have to pay human beings to sit down and, have a chat over online with a customer, looking up real facts and things like that. They could basically have AI do it. But the problem is that AI systems aren't totally reliable. While they're mostly reliable, in many cases, they're going to give you incorrect answers. And not only are they going to give you incorrect answers, but they're going to give you incorrect answers that appear to be true. And so that's causing a large amount of issues as consulting firms are depending on LLMs and people are depending on LLMs in the personal life to do things like write contracts and things like that, when it can get parts of that wrong or a lot of it wrong. And what we're going to do here is talk about why that's occurring and what you can do about it. So keep in mind that LLMs aren't truth machines. They're next word prediction engines. So an LLM's core job is to generate the most likely continuation of text that is given when you enter in your prompt and regurgitate its training patterns. It's good at memorizing things and regurgitating information. This means it optimizes for plausibility and coherence, not for the truth verification. If it's confident, tidy answer, statistically likely, similar in context, you'll often get one that even the model doesn't actually know. They don't know they're hallucinating. People say, well, they're hallucinating on purpose and they should be able to tell us when they don't know something. No, that's not the way it works. And at the end of the day, many LLMs are kind of, dumb because all they're doing is regurgitating their training data. And they're doing so by following patterns based on how we enter the prompts. And so if we're asking it to write an article and we're asking for the article to please, cite specific facts, it may cite specific facts and they may look true and may even give you links to those facts. When you look them up, you're going to find out that those links don't exist. That doesn't mean another similar article doesn't exist. I find that's many times the case. I can correct those things fairly easily. But the fact of the matter is, in many cases, it's just going to give you an answer because you need an answer. It's aiming to please. And if those answers are incorrect, you got to be ready and prepared to deal with that. So the helpful assistant persona creates a people-pleasing bias. Many LLMs are tuned to be helpful, harmless, and agreeable. And that's because they want to be used. And so when people create ChatGPT and Grok and things like that, they tune them to be helpful because they want people to use them. In practice, that can look like, saying yes to a flawed premise, filing a missing detail rather than asking clarifying questions, producing a confident narrative that matches what you seem to want. And the model is rewarded for being useful and smooth, which can conflict with being skeptical and accurate. So they're programmed to provide you with a response, and kind of response no matter what. I'm always taken back when I first started using many of the LLMs out there. They didn't come back with that wasn't part of my training data. They may have talked about that being out of the range of their training data, but they would never admit to having a weak answer or perhaps an answer that's going to be incorrect. And that's because they're programmed to do things that way. And by the way, it doesn't matter which model you're using. People say, well, I'm using, ChatGPT 5.2 and therefore the hallucinations are few and far between. Not really. You're not going to get away from hallucinations by leveraging the current versions of these models or bigger versions of these models. It's all going to be part of the architecture, what an LLM is, and that's the trade-off with the benefits that we get from an LLM. We just have to be aware of them and understand that much of the information that's coming back from this technology is going to be inaccurate, and we have to be very careful to make sure we verify the facts. And of course, people are coming back to me and say, why would I use AI then if I have to go through and fact check everything I get from them? Absolutely right. But there's ways in which you can work around it. And people, have tools and technologies that are able to work around many of the, spotting hallucinations and correcting them. But you got to be aware they're occurring. In many cases, they're very difficult to spot. So hallucinations, compelling answers that are not anchored in reality. And this is when an LLM generates specifics, such as names, citations, numbers, policies, code, behavior, that sound right, but are fabricated or wrong. This happens when the question asks for precise facts, dates, prices, quotes, compatibility specs. I've noticed that as well. If I'm asking for something specific, in many cases, I'm going to get a wrong answer back. And if the info is niche or recent, in other words, it's using a RAG-based technology to find it, it's not trained in the engine, that can be a problem as well. And the prompt pressure implies you must answer. In other words, we're demanding an answer. And again, it's designed to please. And so it's going to provide us with an answer, whether it's accurate or not. It doesn't know that it's in essence doing that. So, for example, GPT 3.5 would tell people I went to MIT. And so when they would go to ChatGPT to, create my bio for, some kind of a magazine article or some sort of a video, it said I had a, graduate degree from MIT. It may seem plausible, unless you met me, but that was inaccurate. And so I didn't mind, but they finally corrected it. But that's an example of something that's going to get something factually wrong. If you're asking for a specific detail, in case of my educational background, it's going to put forward facts, if it doesn't know them, that it deems as plausible. And many people took it as fact because it looked accurate to them. In other words, if it, said I went to Oxford or something, I'm not English, maybe that would be, something that would cause people to check further. But that's always going to be the risk in using LLMs. So confidence is not collaboration. LLMs can sound equally confident when they correct and when they're guessing. So polished structure, bullet points, explanation, sources, professional tone can mask uncertainty. Users often mistake well-written for well-verified. In other words, it's not only plausible, but it's well-written. And so they can write an entire article that can get every fact in the article wrong if you don't watch or check. And that's why I tell people don't use AI to mock up articles and to mock up essays, things like that, unless you understand the subject matter. Else you're going to get got, because it's going to hallucinate. You're not going to understand the hallucination occurs, and you're not going to know enough to actually chase the real facts. So training data does not equal updated reality. Many LLMs have incomplete or outdated, conflicting training data, and that's always going to be the case because normally they're trained from the whole of the information that's out there on the internet. And obviously the internet has, different degrees of truth out there, and certainly a lot of inaccurate information. Without live retrieval, verification, they may, confidently state something and is used to be true, that you assume to be true, but never was true. It was only true in a different context. And again, they don't know as much as we think they know. They're memorizing things. That's all they're doing. Training data is basically the ability to, and I'm not going to get into a technical definition here, there's lots of videos out here on YouTube that tell you how LLMs work and how they consume and train information. But they're looking for patterns. They're looking for patterns to continue the prompt that you're entering in. And they're trying to take a best guess at making it happen. And they're always going to give you an answer. That's why we're leading these things to hallucinations. Now, maybe someday we'll be able to, engineer them out of the LLMs. But, this was called out 20 years ago in PhD dissertations, things like that. When people were moving in this direction, that hallucinations were going to be a problem with some of these large language models that people were looking to build. And lo and behold, 2026, even with the 6th, 7th generation of many of these LLMs, we're still facing that as an issue. So the model may merge multiple smaller things into one fake thing. Common failure mode is attributed to blending, mixing two companies, two studies, two products or two people, into a single answer. And I find this out well. In other words, I found this out when I'm, generating references for an article. Obviously I'm relying on the last few articles that I wrote, in the last few months on a particular topic. And rather than going out with Google and bringing up each one of the articles and cataloging, I just ask ChatGPT, give me the last 3 articles I wrote on this particular topic. And I find it gives me 2, and one of them is incorrect. And one of them is in essence an amalgam of 2 of the articles that are out there. And that was interesting that it came up with that answer rather than giving me the articles that I wrote. So you have to be wary of that. So what can you do to get closer to the truth when using an LLM? I think it's a big question now. Force uncertainty and sourcing. Ask for, what are you sure about? Or what are you least sure about? Get an answer after they respond. List assumptions and what would change the answer. Provide primary sources, links, and label what's verified and inferred. It'll tell you that stuff if you ask. In other words, is this a verifiable source? And they'll say no. In fact, you can kind of have a little mini argument with an LLM. Say, look at the answers you just gave me. Are all these verifiable facts? And it'll go back and it'll say, you caught me. No, this answer is incorrect. They'll admit to it. And then you can go ahead and, change the response, but you gotta know how to do that. So if it can't produce, checkable sources for factual claims, treat the answer as unverified. And that needs to be disclosed. And, in many cases, if I'm using AI for much of the research on an article, and you'll see this on my LinkedIn articles, on the bottom, it will say, AI used to research and edit the article. Just saying that, many of the things may be unverified if I didn't go back and verify them. That doesn't take the onus off on me if I'm giving them incorrect information. I'm still the author of the article. Just using AI as a tool to create it and research it. But it kind of discloses the fact that, there's some tools and technology I'm using that may not be 100% accurate, which I think is what people need to do. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments about this, if this is something you ran into. And anyway, don't forget to like and subscribe and check out my other videos on this channel. Also check out my InfoWorld Cloud Computing blog, my 100+ LinkedIn learning courses, and of course, my generative AI architecture course out on Go Cloud Careers. And finally, my latest books, Unlocking the Power of Cloud. And my Insider's Guide to Cloud Computing. So until next week, stay very, very safe. The magical YouTube algorithm thinks this is another one of my videos that you should watch next. Take care, guys.